Good afternoon. I'm very happy to welcome all of you here to this event. My name is Imme Scholz. I'm the president of the foundation since 3 years. And I'm very much looking forward to our debate with leading experts on China's environmental politics at home and abroad. This event is a joint endeavor by Heinrich Böll Foundation, the Berlin Contemporary China Network, and Dialogue.Earth. You find them there on the slide. And I would like to welcome especially Sam Gall from Dialogue.Earth, who is here with us today. And actually, many of you just came directly from the plane, so thank you very much for this enthusiasm and your presence. In times like ours now, where political alliances and institutions that structured international relations are crumbling and actively being destroyed, it seems like a luxury to discuss Chinese environmental politics, but I'm convinced it is not. Because the crisis of climate and environment and what a superpower like China does about it and why, these are important aspects of the new geopolitical order that is emerging. And I think that we need to understand the new dynamics that characterize it and that influence local and global problem-solving capacities. It therefore, I think, makes a lot of sense to get a broader picture of China's geopolitical role by starting from its environmental politics at home and abroad, and I see that all of you think the same. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. We designed or my colleagues, thank you very much, designed 2 panels for this event today and bring together academics and practitioners to discuss the role of the state in China's domestic environmental policies, as well as its extending outreach into the global south. Against the backdrop of these tremendous geopolitical uncertainties I mentioned in the beginning, the event seeks to interrogate China's potential future role in global governance by discussing the linkages and divergences between its domestic practices and its international behavior. The first panel will look into domestic environmental politics in the PRC. Our distinguished guests, Isa Ding, Yifei Li, and Sam Gall, will try to give you an overview on this complex matter and elaborate what these dynamics mean for China's environment, its people, and the future of political accountability. The second panel will focus on China as an actor in the global south with examples from Latin America, which will be presented and commented by Tom Baxter, Parsival Di Sola, and Marina Rudiak. Regarding current geopolitical developments, panelists will discuss one pressing question. How might the US withdrawal from global governance issues change both China's foreign policies and their implementation and public perceptions of China as an actor in these fields? This event is a rare opportunity of bringing together experts from different fields and expertise, and we are very happy to realize such an opportunity. And prior to this event, HBS and Dialogue.Earth had a great cooperation on China's engagement in Latin America with a 2-day-long workshop in Mexico City last year, which brought together relevant observers of this trend. And this cooperation happily resulted in a series of articles, which you can find online, in English on the website of Dialogue.Earth and in German on the HBS website. As I said in the beginning, Isa Ding and Yifei Li are just coming from a conference organized by Humboldt University Berlin on state capacity and environmental governance in China and brought along many of those participants in the conference, it seems to me, and are therefore also perfectly prepared to share their latest insights from these debates on the conference. After the event, we prepared a get-together, which will be in the downstairs in the cafeteria, and we hope that all of you stay a bit longer after the event to network and continue the discussion. Thank you.
Very warm welcome. My name is Paul Kohlenberg. I'm an officer here in the Asia division of Heinrich Böll Foundation. I don't have to add many words of welcome. I think we can jump right in. Just one note of housekeeping for this panel and for the other. If you want to quote or cite anybody, then please approach the speaker afterwards, whether that is okay. Otherwise, I think paraphrasing what you learn and hear here today is fine. And there will be a recording of some type, but we're not live streaming it at the moment. So this evening is about Chinese environmental politics. We start with the domestic realm. I think all three speakers here, panelists with me, were already introduced. So I'll just say, check out their work. We have on the very right, Isa Ding, who has recently published a book called The Performative State. Next to her, Professor Yifei Li, Isa Ding from Northwestern University, Chicago, and Yifei Li, NYU, Shanghai, NYU Global. Also, of course, as everyone here, well published, but I mentioned China Goes Green with Judith Shapiro. And then, of course, Sam Gale, CEO of China Dialogue, which, if you don't know, add it to your feeds. It's the best place to get news on environmental stuff, and I guess more beyond that. So, maybe Isa, I start with you. Let's keep this conversational. There are many China experts here in the room, but maybe not everyone knows about China's environmental trajectory over the last 1 or 2 decades. This is a big question, but if you need to point out to some inflection points, some general trends that you think are really important to familiarize everyone with, where would you go?
Thank you. So I would say, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I would say a few inflection points to me, in my memory, would be first 2007. That's the Beijing Summer Olympics, when foreign athletes started training in Beijing and reporting the respiratory symptoms that they were experiencing. And this is, at least in my memory, one of the turning points when Beijing's air pollution in China started to appear in international news headlines. And then the second round of that was January 2013. January 13, 2013, I believe. It's the day when the so-called air apocalypse in Beijing, when air pollution blasted through the upper meter, the upper limit of the air monitor in Beijing, and then that landed Beijing's air pollution, but also China's environmental problems in the New York Times and also other major international headlines. And then I would say these are the two points after which both the international audience, but also the general public had started to pay greater attention to air pollution. And obviously, the American embassy tweeting out air quality data also contributed to that. And that was before Twitter. X was Twitter, and Twitter was banned in China. However, my colleague, Deborah Alexson, would argue that environmental governance, or kind of more and more stringent environmental governance, had already been taking place even around that time. So it wasn't this dramatic shift in terms of state attention toward environmental governance. But in terms of salience, I think that's definitely 2 turning points that shifted at least public opinion. And then following that, and also building on the existing efforts that the state had been doing, then you had the expansion of the environmental bureaucracy, the streamlining of the bureaucracy, the elevation of the MEP to the MEE, and then eventually the incorporation of climate change under their jurisdiction. So there is that. However, in recent years, and I think the 2 latest inflection points in my view would be 2018, the trade war, and then 2019, COVID. And obviously, COVID wasn't just this one year. That's when I noticed public opinion concerning environmental pollution has lost its dominant position on the priority of the public, and I think that makes great sense. Number one, the economy has been slowing down, and then you could go there and see the economic struggles and pains that people have been going through, and obviously, when that's on the line, even the urban middle class would start to care less about pollution and environment and climate change, and I think we're seeing this in Germany as well. So then what's really interesting in my view now is going forward, I think it is really the future is open-ended. And domestically, on one hand, you do see the state is still pushing through the ecological civilization agenda, and then it does seem like, although despite some recent retrenchments, it doesn't seem like they're fully pulling back on their efforts at environmental enforcement. But just me kind of imagining different scenarios and what could possibly happen, I'm wondering to myself, to what extent could we see a scenario in which the state is pushing ahead these ecological, environmental, climate agendas, and the public is becoming more cautious and saying, okay, why don't we worry about putting food on the table first? And this is kind of me making up a scenario, but I also don't see this kind of being completely ruled out as a possibility. So I think then we'll see this really interesting shift and even reversal in terms of who wants what. And then I think I'll just end here.
Yeah, that's great. I think because it's a perfect moment to bring Ife into the conversation, because, I mean, I guess you probably identify as a sociologist. And you wrote in the past about environmental sentiment. And maybe can you relate some of these turning points to how you perceive of environmental sentiment in China?
Thank you. Perfect segue. I mean, one of the things I feel, especially in the recent couple of years, is a really important area, but not receiving enough attention from academics and observers alike, is public environmental sentiments. And by that, I don't just mean, going out and doing surveys, asking people, do you care about the environment on a scale of 1 to 5, all right? But it's about actually understanding how people are responding to, what you might call weird weathers, lots of rain, and that sort of thing. It's important because, in part because China's high pressure, or what you might even call pressure cooker model of environmental governance operates, at least in part, on the assumption that if the states work really hard to impose all of these mandates and rules and regulations, the public will follow suit. The public will respond to all of these high-minded proclamations coming from the top. In other words, the overall assumption is that if the state is being high-minded enough, people will become interested, people will act voluntarily in the end. Maybe initially it was, coercive, and then people would comply, but then eventually the goal is to sort of create this almost utopian model of the state instituting things and the public just pick up the signals and then follow their leadership. Then the real question is that actually happening at all? And you could even imagine a perfectly reasonable alternative argument in which you would say the state is doing way too much to a point where the public is not feeling that they have the responsibility to act at all. And that second theory seems to be something for which we have evidence. I worked with a Michigan state-based sociologist by the name of Ren Xuefei. We conducted ethnographic research in a number of Chinese cities to try to precisely address that. Because we feel when we survey the literature, there's so much that's been said about Chinese environmental experiences from the top-down point of view, looking at state policies, looking at institutions, looking at power struggles and all that. But there's not enough appreciation for how people on the receiving end of that state-led model of enforcement is actually responding at all, and how people are responding. We're finding that people are checking out. People are feeling that if recycling is such a top-down mandate, if everything has to be, if everybody has to follow the exact specifications given by the state about how to sort all their garbage every day, people are feeling overwhelmed. On top of what Isa said earlier, economic hardship that everybody all around the world are having to deal with. When you're even struggling with putting food on the table to begin with, each additional requirement in the name of the environment just could seem even more onerous than they are. So we're actually finding a good amount of evidence of what we call ecological oblivion. People are simply not paying attention. People are checking out. People are indifferent to what you might consider ecological disasters right around us. And that seems to be a really, really problematic side effect of China's model, this high pressure cooker model of environmental governance. It doesn't create a citizenry that has a genuine care for the ecosystem, and on the contrary, it creates a citizenry that just becomes indifferent to that whole system.
Fascinating. I mean, such a contrast to a lot of what I think we assumed would grow out of the environmental movements earlier on. But I mean, we don't want the audience to check out, so you will have questions ready, hopefully, in a few minutes. But before we do that, I want to ask Sam, I mean, I forgot to mention your book, which you published in 2013 on China's environment. And when you hear this and when you look back at the time, and you've been such an active follower of all that discourse, I mean, what did you not expect to happen since then? And where do you see kind of major administrative legal reforms or other changes that weren't already mentioned?
Thanks very much, and thank you for the invitation. I think reflecting on that time, I note all of those kind of points in time that my colleague Isa mentioned, and would say there are corresponding moments that we could talk about that sort of sit in contrast or sit alongside them. So if we think about the Olympics in 2008, we also think about the great financial crisis at the same time, and China's response to that financial crisis, and the way that in particular it led to a reinforcement of top-down industrial policy that specifically started to target some of the low-carbon industries that are now sort of world-leading. If we think about 2013, 2014, and the introduction of air pollution regulations in the sort of eastern seaboard cities in China, it also happens to be the same time that you have the first joint US-China announcement on cooperating together on climate change that seemed to really underpin climate progress that led to the Paris Agreement. If we think about 2017, 2018 and the trade war, also thinking about this moment when Xi Jinping goes to Davos and says, you know, China's still in here as a responsible stakeholder. We're staying the course on Paris, to this kind of joy and sort of open arms of kind of well, particularly Europe, in wanting to see that there was still some defense, as it seemed then, of the kind of liberal international order. And there's a kind of push and pull there, I think, between the domestic and the international that, with hindsight, I don't think I quite expected. I think what I saw at the time was over the period that I was writing up to 2013, so the sort of previous decade, two parallel movements happening. A top-down focus appearing through media, through the control of civic expression and civil society, and through kind of innovation and industrial policy. So in the civic space, you could see where a kind of burgeoning growth of environmental activism was being subsumed instead by a very tightly regulated sort of civic sphere that prioritized the environment, but in a far more professionalized, technocratic way, and sought to control and ultimately to squash a lot of the kind of environmental groups that had grown up. In the media sphere, what had been quite a freewheeling largely private kind of liberal media sphere being gradually pushed and fragmented and also subsumed by sort of new technologies. And in the realm of what had been a largely kind of demand-led grassroots innovation space, and indeed a very privately oriented and export-oriented set of industries around solar, EV, and batteries and so on, the growth of a very state-centric, IP-intensive, top-down model of innovation that ultimately bore fruit. And I suppose what I wouldn't have expected is quite how successful the latter part has been, and quite how world-leading and well-aligned with political economy, climate action goals remain at the sort of high level in the party, and quite how successfully party-led the kind of eco-civilization agenda has been, even as it's really managed to quite successfully denigrate or squash a lot of the grassroots energy that effectively laid down the gauntlet to China's model of sort of pollute first and clean up later.
Wow, thank you. There's a lot of different things that we could pick up on right now. Maybe I start with kind of the nexus of technology, nationalism, and so on, and throw kind of a more academic question to the professors here. Maybe Isa, we start with you. I mean, conceptually, what are helpful terms to you when you think about how the Chinese state developed in terms of this technological superpower in the environmental realm?
Yeah, I think the first concept would be what you just mentioned, techno-nationalism. I think when I have traveled to China in recent years, that's the word that comes up in my mind when I see what's happening in the companies, in the sphere of innovation. And sometimes I approach my observations with a lot of suspicion, but I have to say a lot of them have been successful, have been innovative. And I believe industrial planning played a big part, state funding played a big part, but I think undergirding that, and also this is now unique to China, played a part in the development of the East Asian tigers, is also techno-nationalism, and especially in reaction to pressures from the United States. And the other related concept, I would say, it might seem contradictory, but it is not, I don't think it's a concept, but I see a lot of growth fatigue. And then by which I don't mean that people don't want to see economic growth anymore, but people, well, number one, they have to accept that economic growth is not going to happen at 10% a year. But again, this is not unique to China, in the United States as well. And then I teach this class on political economy of development, and I taught this. I teach this in the United States, and I had the opportunity to teach that to at the LSE, Fudan LSE summer school. So some of my students were Chinese, and then I always teach them this new thing, this green growth versus degrowth debate. And then to my surprise, that not just students, and then kind of I show them the whole entire debate. You have, the Jason Hickel, Milankovitch on one end, and the green growther on the other. And then at the end, I would say, okay, who are you more convinced by? And I was very surprised that both my students in the United States and students in China are very sympathetic toward the notion of degrowth. And obviously, it has to be very clearly defined, not that we're actively forcing ourselves to become into poverty. But I think, people have to adjust. People have to adjust this new normal of slow growth, and there's a lot of kind of fatigue with classical notions of economic development, and that's putting GDP first, but then putting overlooking other aspects of well-being. both psychological well-being, but also, physical well-being, material well-being, and I see that also in especially the younger generations. And what that means is that when it comes to things like environmental governance and climate change, I think there may be a way in which the narrative would shift either through top-down propaganda or through kind of more of a co-production, if you will, of the private and public, and kind of moving toward or merging, marrying these larger ecological civilizational goals. And I don't like the term, but it just came out of my mouth. And also climate goes with this acceptance and this adaptation to the new normal of not GDP-obsessed growth, but kind of growth in either specific areas that are important, or perhaps even focusing on innovation, or focusing more on well-being. So I think there are a lot of possibilities, and I don't think people in China or outside of China have an answer yet. But I think in just visiting China in recent years, those are the two phenomena that I noticed with the people I talk to in society, but also in business.
Thank you. I mean, if I also adding to what Sam just said and something you said earlier about kind of the shift in what the nexus of civil society and environmental work in China has become. And we as a foundation also kind of started with the assumption that this is a space where you can kind of then extend and make good connections and work towards the civil society in some sense. Do you think that those days are no longer, there to be plausibly expected? Like, what is your take on that?
I mean, current affairs are humbling in the sense that we have these assumptions about what's possible within the Chinese civil society space, because obviously when I was an undergraduate student, I'm not going to tell you which year because that's going to reveal my age, but when I was an undergraduate student, it was almost universal consensus that the environment is not a sensitive topic for anything. And it was widely accepted that on campus, students could have environmental events freely without any fear of intervention from authorities. And there were plenty of environmental NGOs that were just popping up everywhere in China doing all sorts of environmental work. So the impression that I had back then was most certainly that if I commit myself to the environmental cause in China, that not only is a safe bet, it certainly is going to be something that can potentially lead to very meaningful changes. And I was terribly ill-informed, obviously. Because things just took these dramatic turns in the sense that it doesn't necessarily become a more sensitive issue within a relatively short period of time because the government doesn't want better environment. It's because they want it so badly that ecological civilization all of a sudden rose from, basically the side of the major national meetings to the very center of the central government and of the party's political agenda. So much so that this entire ecological civilization discourse takes up nearly all of the space of the party school training programs, takes up their entire rhetoric about how China's model is unique. And how it's different from sort of the American-led or the Europe-led world order, to a point where this becomes politically sensitive, not because they don't want it, because they want it so badly that they want a uniform, singular discourse on the subject that they don't really want people to just freely comment on what ecological civilization means. And then things took another quite surprising and dramatic turn in the last, I want to say, maybe 3 years, as the field of the environment becomes all of a sudden far more securitized than it were in the past. Because environmental NGOs were indeed collecting an awful lot of data about the environment, and this drive to securitization basically meant that all of a sudden, the kind of data collection exercises that they've been doing for decades now becomes an act of espionage, according to Public Security Bureau folks. And you know, I know for a fact that several NGOs within China were, they got themselves into a tremendous amount of trouble simply because of the data they were collecting. And now many of these NGOs, some of them are sort of back in operation, but with a much lower profile, but many of them simply went out of business. So we started, you know, maybe less than 2 decades ago with an area of concern that was widely considered as safe and promising, and then it became sensitive, and now all of a sudden it became an absolutely no-go area. And I feel it's humbling for us because, you know, the environment is indeed a rapidly changing field. And, you know, environmental politics most certainly is even more radically transforming than anyone could perhaps predict.
So, I mean, our President Imre Scholz in the opening words alluded to a lot of the geopolitical shifts that are going on. We are going to address that more in the second panel, but nonetheless, I think as a segue and preparatory thoughts, I would like to ask you, Sam, where do you see kind of a continuation of domestic logics into the international realm? And where do you think that logic is really not that applicable?
Thanks. Yeah, I was thinking about this question actually after I had the pleasure of seeing a really interesting intervention last week by scholar Seren. I noted her name. I have to come back to a German scholar who was looking at the kind of extension of domestic logics into the international in the context of kind of shifting industrial policy. So saying, you know, how China's Go West policy essentially sort of laid the groundwork for the Belt and Road Initiative, how industrial upgrading within China's own sort of domestic system led into Made in China 2025. And I found myself thinking, have we seen that? And to what extent have we seen that in the environmental realm? And how equivalent is it? Or is there something slightly different at work? And as far as I thought there are some decent examples one could point to of this sort of the attempts, at least, to push China's specific environmental models kind of globally, but I'm not sure it reads across as simply. And I got this far really, which is to think about moments like the shift from Xi Jinping's 2020 pledge at the UNGA to the following year. On the pledge to exit coal projects around the world, and to think about what, you know, do those look the same? That sort of that domestic announcement and that international announcement. Well, I think, you know, it's a genuinely interesting question to look at. The Xi Jinping announcement at the UNGA in 2020 was, you know, a unilateral announcement, in contrast to the bilateral one that Xi Jinping and Barack Obama made in 2014, you know, I noted earlier, and really sort of transformed a lot of climate diplomacy. This 2020 announcement was made unilaterally, and as far as I understand, was made really without any warm-up or expectations, even within the environmental bureaucracy in China. It was really unexpected, and sent, as I understand it, a really enormous sort of signal through the Chinese industry and bureaucracy. It ended up really reshaping a lot of legislative work, a lot of party documents. It really sent a signal through the system and meant a lot. And it's significant then that the following year, Xi Jinping returns to the UNGA and makes another unilateral environmental announcement, this time about China cleaning up its coal fleet globally. And similarly, it's a very terse message, doesn't say that much, and should send a signal. But I guess the question is, did it? And was it able to? And I think the answer is it wasn't, at least not to the same extent today. Because as far as I can tell, and our colleagues will sort of return to this in the next panel, I don't think China's overseas trade and investment has the same degree of planning or coherence in its current form as the highly sort of centralized and integrated economic planning systems that exist within China's own economy. And maybe I'll leave it there and you guys can kind of pick this up further.
Fantastic. So there is a microphone in the room for the audience to ask questions. And I think we have about 20, 25 minutes for that. I'm sure there are many different storylines that we could pick up on and continue to discuss. Please raise your hands and arms. I see one right in the back. And if there are more questions, then we should be able to collect maybe 2 or 3 of them. So if there are more questions, keep on raising. But you go ahead.
So thanks. All right. Thank you for the talk until here. So I agree that maybe a long-term change in environment politics can only happen when you raise awareness in the populace. And I can also see that when you don't have food on the table, that you can't really take your time off and think about the environment, maybe. Where I disagree, though, is that the problem is the top to bottom change, for example, or that such a transformation can happen in China. Or what I mean is, I think the real issue is not, for example, the upper class and the industry that are the biggest factor in environment problems. And I see the issue with the policies that are being pushed. So for me, the question is, shouldn't China follow other policies to actually transform the economy? I know that the transformation of the economy, that will hinder economic growth. But for example, Inner Mongolia has giant fields that are operating on coal and other like industries that are not so economically friendly. So maybe they're just pushing the wrong policies at the moment, and there should be a change in that area. What do you think?
Perfect. And then there is another question here in the second row. So, in the middle of the second row. Thank you, Ella.
Thank you so much for the talk. I want to pick up on some, international political economy question. There's this current, I think Bloomberg wrote a recent article on the second China shock. I guess identified the cause as domestic subsidies and low domestic consumption, and basically the new green tech exports being exported abroad, and an increasing number of both European but also global South countries are erecting trade barriers toward it because they want to retain or expand their own manufacturing capacity. I'm wondering how you see this tension between decarbonizing and keeping your own manufacturing sector alive. Thanks.
Excellent. Those are big questions. I'm looking for volunteers on stage who would like to take those. I know maybe Isa, you want to go first?
I can try. Yeah, I think on the public question, I actually completely agree with you. To me, whatever solves the problem, I don't think if it's a good measure, it's a good measure. It comes from top down, then it's still a good measure. And if it's bottom up, it's a good measure too. And I think we were just talking about this at the earlier conference. It's this idea. I mean, I think academia is also complicit, but also not just academia. I think, our whole public discourse and policy discourse that place blame and responsibility on the individual to solve this climate change thing. So think about behavioral economics, all these experiments. I've done them myself, so I am complicit. Done these experiments to say, okay, what can I do to shift the consumer, to nudge the consumer so then they can buy LED light bulb but not incandescent light bulb? Again, it's it's a good thing to buy green, and it's a good thing to recycle. We were talking about recycling earlier, but it is also true that there's a lot of money that goes behind these campaigns to recycle from oil and gas, and there's a larger agenda to actually shape public discourse so that we place blame on the individuals, that individuals feel that they are responsible, and obviously this is a universal phenomenon. So I agree with you, but then I'm also kind of torn on this matter because in the case of China, or at least on looking at the causes of government enforcement or more stringent enforcement of air pollution measures, of air quality measures in recent years. State planning was a part, international influence was a part, but also public opinion played a very, very important part. I think without these protests online, offline, we would see different outcomes. For instance, we can name a lot of examples, such as these protests against the incinerators, and we can look at protests in the rural areas. We can look at all these protests. So I do feel like public opinion is not completely useless, but I agree with you in thinking about those issues, placing too much attention on the individual and on the public does the job of shifting blame on the people who are not responsible for that. And I think this also goes for climate change at the global level. There is also, who has done the emitting that caused the global warming. There is the sensitive issue of historical responsibility, which China has more and more of every year. But then there's also to what extent should the Global South bear the burden of dealing with those challenges when they weren't the ones that created these problems to begin with? So I think it works on all these different levels. Let me think about the political economy question, but I think you wanted to add to that.
I mean, I really like the question about, why don't they close down these Inner Mongolian coal mines? I mean, obviously I want them to close too. But the real challenge is there's a lot of wishful thinking. I don't read German, but there's a lot of wishful thinking in the English language discussion about China that basically, plays with this idea that the Chinese government is so powerful. If they just want to close these mines, they most certainly can do it, overnight. Not true. I mean, if it's hard to close a mine here in Germany, it's hard to close a mine in China. It's not about democracy versus authoritarian states. It really is not. That these labels for political regimes don't really mean much once you get down to the nitty-gritty of actually working to get something done. So it's just as hard to close a coal mine, and they're not closing these coal mines, even though they have the sort of theoretically the top-down instruments to accomplish that. But the vested interests of these industries are simply too significant. But then to the question about Chinese exports of supposedly green products, I think one of the things we honestly need to ask ourselves, especially in relation to Isa's earlier comment about green growth versus degrowth, is that how much of that stuff is actually green? If we take a life cycle analysis, what environmental scientists call cradle-to-cradle analysis, the entire environmental, material, carbon, and energy costs of making, say, an electric vehicle, I am not convinced that there is robust evidence to say that that's necessarily good for the environment. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence to say that that's not good for the environment. And yet, sort of the exact reason why Chinese exports of cheap green products has a market is because the prevailing political narrative is that that's green. That's good stuff. So long as we switch from a gas car to an electric car, we can continue to drive as much as we want. We can continue to consume as much as we want. I'm not sure that's backed up by scientific evidence. So I think the bigger question isn't really how do we continue to understand, capitalism 2.0 or green capitalism and how to fend off Chinese exports. But the real question is, if we're serious about the green transition, we need to get serious about the ungreen qualities, about these supposedly green products.
Sorry.
You can jump in and add something, and then we...
Oh yeah, just very quickly, I thought about the question, and I think I have a pretty simple answer, which is, I think what you're describing is very real in terms of this trade-off of, let's assume that EVs are welcome, and especially given if the battery technology can improve so that they don't have to be put away every 25 years, so then maybe we'll get to that stage where EVs are a good replacement for, but anyway, I think on your question, I think the trade-off is very real, and I think we're seeing this not just in 2025. In Germany, we're seeing this for hundreds of years, and we're seeing this, while the United States had started to develop its economy. We saw this in the Corn Laws, and we see this in this whole debate has been ongoing for hundreds of years. And I think, normatively speaking, I believe it is every country's right to erect a trade barrier if they want to erect a trade barrier, if this is done with the consent of the people, with the popular, with a democratic mandate, and I think what's at stake, or what's perhaps could be counterproductive, is that perhaps in some situations the jobs would be phased out anyway, with or without, let's say, imports from China or from elsewhere. And I think it is every government's responsibility to do a real calculation, a cost-benefit, a boring old cost-benefit analysis to look at to what extent do these barriers hurt or help benefit our society, and then who are the ones who are going to be hurt, and how do we protect them? I think it just comes down to a good, I don't know if it's an industrial strategy, but a good government planning. But a problem is nowadays there is a tariff arms race, so these things are heavily politically charged, and we're not really talking about the China shock or raising tariffs because we've done a full calculus of the costs and the benefits. So I think that's the danger here.
Very good. Now, I think the last point is particularly salient, but over to you, Sam.
Yeah, I'll keep it very brief. I agree with both of my colleagues here, and really excellent points kind of across the board. Briefly on the kind of, I guess, balance between bottom-up and top-down approaches. I agree with everything said, but I guess I would add that I don't really view climate change as a problem per se. If it's a problem, it's a wicked problem, which is to say it's marked by complexity. There isn't a solution to climate change. There's a range of different responses and measures that we need to take at different points along the chain, but it's something like poverty or injustice, a kind of condition that we're dealing with at various stages. And what you need in response to those kinds of wicked problems is not a single top-down solution, but a more complex, adaptive, resilient society that can deal with a whole range of different problems, the solutions to which will often create further problems, just like any truly complex problem. The comparison, my favorite kind of analogy for this being, what's complicated? Going on a long car journey with your kid. What's complex? Parenting, bringing up a child, right? It's a completely different order of problem. So I think the top-down goes somewhere, and it's important. And of course, I agree that the politics, the vested interest, the protracted bargaining that characterize China's energy policy making means that coal hasn't been dethroned in the way it should have been. But it still requires more than just the top-down. On trade barriers, industrial policy, completely agree with what Isa was saying, which is essentially that trade protectionism didn't start 2 months ago with Trump, right? There's a very long history, and even just in recent years, there's a very complex set of arguments playing out in global South countries around the need to capture value in these emerging technologies, putting aside the question of how green they are, at least the technologies of the future that are being heavily sort of targeted by major, industrial champions trying to corner parts of that market. I would say that, yeah, I mean, there's a number of big questions raised by the kind of really intense kind of economic statecraft that's now playing out. But there isn't a country like China that has managed to this extent corner every section of that of those supply chains. When we talk about those key technologies, something like the EV, for example, it is pretty remarkable the extent to which China has managed to very successfully create a foothold in the upstream, midstream, and downstream parts of that, in the manufacturing, in the mining, and indeed in the midstream refining, which actually nobody else is doing. So, yes, I'm sure that there's all kinds of economic volatility to come, but I also do think that Chinese government did a very good job of sort of targeting some of these key industries as strategic niches and really developing very effective industrial strategy to sort of support growth there.
So we're entering the final stretch, and I'm very happy to see some hands already. There's one in the back first, and then over here.
Thank you for this great panel. I really enjoy listening to you, and I also enjoy that we're talking about politics, but you all elaborated very well how that ties in with compliance by the people. And you talked about values of economic development being now in conflict with environmental goals, but I'm also wondering what you say to this myth, or is it a myth that we actually see a lot more of like openness to scientific findings and technologies when it comes to the environmental questions and climate than we see in other societies? I think that's sometimes brought up as an explanation for why people are, to a certain degree, quite compliant once a policy is in place, because they're still convincible by scientific findings, which is probably in contrast to people in other societies where we have conflicting religious, economic, ideological values that stand as a barrier to accept something like climate change or something. So there is this narrative, and I think there are some surveys showing that there's less climate denialism in China than in other contexts. I don't know if you have anything on that, which might also explain somewhat the policy acceptancy in China. Thank you.
And then here in the second row, and maybe if there's someone who wants to add a third question, this will be the final chance. So over there, okay.
So thank you three for sharing your thoughts. I think it's very insightful to listen to you. I have a question for Professor Li specifically, because I couldn't help but notice that we have some parallel things happening in Germany as well. I don't know how much you are into German politics, but the last election has also shown that the environment is not on the top priority list anymore, and that also happened after the government began to implement stricter laws, or tried to implement stricter laws. So as a fellow sociologist, I would like to ask, why do you think that check-out effect or that environmental fatigue really occurs? And what would we have to do differently to kind of spark the motivation in people again to do something? Yes.
Super. And then third row in the middle.
Thank you very much. Kind of attaching to that question, so we have seen some provinces in China ramp up their environmental protection laws, especially some of the very highly developed provinces on the coast. And as far as I've seen, that has led to some heavily polluting industries reducing their production or moving west. Given the current economic slowdown, could this maybe slow down the path for further regulation in these provinces? Or have they committed to this path of further regulation and environmental protection?
Thank you. So, myth, more open to science, fatigue, and environmental laws. Maybe Sam, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll particularly try and address that first question because I think it's super interesting. My view on this, I guess, is shaped by a couple of different moments where I've tried to kind of dig into this question in two different fields. One around the consensus on climate change and to what extent there's a kind of wider acceptance of that, and the other actually around the science of an acceptance of the environmental risks or not around genetically modified foods, both of which I've done some research on in China, and both of which I think are interesting public debates that are actually very different and play out very differently in terms of education levels, class, and other sort of markers. In the Chinese context, my impression, as you say, from this kind of polling and so on, is that there's pretty high levels of awareness about the sort of anthropogenic climate change. I certainly think there's a very high level of awareness in political elites in China, and that consensus was established earlier than in many other countries, actually. Certainly by 2006, China was doing kind of big integrated national vulnerability assessments on how climate change would impact environmental systems, food, the vulnerability of China's eastern seaboard to sea level rise, water systems, and so on. So I think it's true to an extent that there's a very highly technocratic political elite who kind of get climate change, have a broad understanding of the kind of consensus on it, and yet kind of the same, in the same era, sort of late 2000s, early sort of 2010s, when I was living in China and doing research among Chinese journalists and activists and so on, I would quite often ask the question, what do you think about the science of climate change? Do you get it? Do you read about climate change? And quite frequently, even from very engaged environmental activists and journalists and so on, they'd kind of shrug and say, oh, I don't know, I don't really read about it. But because actually the interest was really not, and the motivating, the reason that people are motivated by environmental issues in the Chinese context, at least at that time, was not global climate change and the long-term temperature rise and the vulnerabilities associated with that. It was, even when they were working on climate change issues, more directly domestic environmental pollution, and the fact that there was an obvious co-benefit to moving away from coal, to moving away from CO2 sort of intensive industries towards a cleaner alternative. And for those involved in the kind of low carbon industry, and indeed those in sort of political elites, often also that it was already obvious that this aligned with being a leader in the technologies of the future and being part of this kind of low carbon wave, as it was often called then. And so the interest and the kind of enthusiasm or level of consensus around climate change, I kind of came to think didn't really matter that much. It was that there was a strong alignment around the co-benefits and around the economic benefits. As for the other sort of question, or the other part of that, which I wanted to quickly address, I, a little bit later, ended up working quite a lot on the supposed low carbon benefits of genetically modified maize and how that could be part of or corn, how that could be part of a kind of a supposedly more environmentally friendly food system. And what I would say from the data, such as it exists, and there isn't that much high quality data, but I did some surveys and others have tried to, is that there's a very high degree of skepticism about the value of genetic modification in a way that sits very differently with the actual scientific consensus among scientists. That is to say, there's a much higher degree of skepticism, and that doesn't track with education level, which is to say that more educated, more affluent people are far more skeptical of the benefits of genetically modified foods than farmers, for example, who often know about genetically modified crops because they plant them and they understand them and generally are very accepting of them. So, it confounds some of those expectations. If I had longer, I'd go more into like why and how I think that works and how it compares to Europe, which is sort of similar. But it was interesting. So I wouldn't presume that these things track that simply.
Perfect. Maybe Ife, if you Your 3 minutes
These are,
and then 3
these are
minutes
all
for you.
such amazing questions. So thank you all for asking them. For the sake of time, I'll only address the sociological question, as it were. That's such a great question in the sense that, well, first of all, I know absolutely nothing about German politics, except for the fact that the AfD apparently has a strong following, and that's very troubling to my mind. But your question about sort of the broader implication of people choosing to adopt this indifferent reaction to the climate crisis, I mean, perhaps I don't have the evidence for it, but perhaps it is a global phenomenon, and perhaps COVID did play a role, and perhaps the global economic downturn did play a role in the sense that the younger generation don't seem to see a future for a lot of the things that they do, and they're checking out. And that's really, so you asked about what we can do, and I feel that's a really, really hard question to answer. Because in part I feel in order to get the next generation to come back and care about these issues, we'll have to build a community for them. And building the community to begin with requires some level of care. So we have a chicken egg problem right here. And I don't know honestly where to begin to break the cycle. I would only say, perhaps folks in this room, build your own community. Have your own environmental events, and that's what I've been telling my students. I always tell them, if you're too busy, at least do it around Earth Day. Earth Week, Earth Month, whatever you call it. And China calls it, interestingly enough, Climate Awareness Week. I only learned that last week. My students told me, what are you going to do during Climate Awareness Week? I was like, when's that? And they're like, it's AKA Earth Day. So I learned something new there. But the point really is you have to find your own community in order to build momentum, in order to be able to even imagine alternatives and be able to sort of restore that sense of care when the whole world is checked out. Or burnt out, or in Chinese language world, it's the what's the term? The lie flat generation. People are not getting engaged, and I believe you're right that it's most certainly not a uniquely Chinese problem. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. I mean, the positive connotations were already kind of a perfect last word for this panel, but nonetheless, Lisa, you have the last word.
I'll address the other two questions, and the first is on the moving of some of the polluting factories, plants to inland parts of China. I think that's happening, and I think on average, if we were to measure air quality in China, you'll see significant improvement over the years. But if we were to look at the distribution, I haven't done that, but I have hypothesized if we're looking at the distribution of air quality across Chinese localities, and perhaps you'll see a change in that. So although average, it's better, but then in terms of who is bearing the cost, and there is the movement toward the inland areas, and I think this is why it's addressing these issues is not just an empirical question. It also is really about these philosophical questions, ethical questions of justice and what is fair, and then how do society distribute the burden and so forth. And I think that's what we have less of in China in particular. And then on the science question, I'm kind of torn between, on one hand, thinking that it is true that I think in China, I think there is, at least amongst the urban middle class, that belief in science is very strong. Therefore, there is not as much skepticism towards science. But then at the same time, I'm reminded of during COVID, different kinds of cures that people have come up with, and so I think the tendency for somebody to be disenchanted by science, to be drawn to some of the more kind of mythical cures and mythical explanations to scientific phenomena probably also exists in China too. But then in this very case, very awkwardly, I think it is you know, the authoritarian, if you will, implementation of science that is preventing climate denial or denial of science at this massive scale. So that's kind of the awkward question, because education at the end of the day is an authoritarian measure. Science is authoritarian. It monopolizes one truth. So then if we believe in this one truth compared to the others, it is, and then if we believe we have to implement that, we have to, you know, teach people the scientific truth, and there's it is, in essence, a quite authoritarian measures. I think that's kind of the awkward, tricky issue, which is to say that, and I think in the case of China, what's lacking is, so on one hand, you have very fast scientific innovation advancement in recent years. I've just read about the battery technology and these new cancer cures that have gone through the first trials. But I think, and I was very intrigued by the debates on genetic modification when it comes to crops. But then there's now genetic modification when it comes to embryos and medical treatments. And I think there lacks more of these ethical, philosophical meditation debates, discussions within China when it comes to the ethics of science and how much science is too much science, because science can go very wrong, as it has in human history. And I think while it's a good thing, at the same time, I would wish for there to be more of such ethical and philosophical debates about the ethics of science in China, at least.
Fantastic. I mean, this has been such a rich discussion. Thank you so much to all three of you. Maybe join me in giving them a hand of applause. We could go on for hours. We will go straight to the second panel now. If you have more questions, please stick around. After the second panel, we'll do a little bit of informal gathering, and then maybe you can approach the panelists again. And yes, please, the second panel come up. I'll get you some new glasses.
All right, I guess that's a bit of a bathroom break for some, but we're going to start right away looking at the time. So my name is Merle Groneweg. I work at the Humboldt University of Berlin, and I'm coordinating events for the Berlin Contemporary China Network, which, in case you don't know it, connects the different universities in Berlin, the Free University, the Technical University, the Humboldt University, and also the two Max Planck Institutes. So we bring together scholars working on China, and then we often like to do collaborations such as the one today. So from my side, also a big thank you to the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung or Foundation. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm most excited actually about this opportunity to bring together academics and then practitioners from civil society and to have a kind of exchange. So the second panel, as you can see, will shift a bit towards China as an actor in the global south, although the first panel has already touched upon some of those questions, and we will ask how environmental politics factor in. We will look at investment flows, we will talk a bit about trade relations, but then also we will address the question a bit how China is positioning itself actually as an actor in the scene internationally. I think we are aware that often there's this sense that China would like to portray itself as a leader of the global south, as much as this term is quite complicated. And so these are some of the themes that we will explore. And we have three fantastic panelists, which I would like to introduce briefly. So first, Tom Baxter from Dialogue.Earth will give a short input. Tom's the global China editor there, and he focuses on China's role in sustainable development and global environmental governance. And you also work particularly closely with the Africa editorial team at Dialogue.Earth. And then afterwards comes Parsifal de Sola, who's the executive director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, which is the China Latin America Research Center, an independent NGO based in Bogota. dedicated to documenting and analyzing China's role in Latin America and the Caribbean. And you, Parsifal, you specialize in China's foreign policy towards the region with a particular focus on Venezuela. And then last but not least, of course, we have Marina Rudjak with us, who is the assistant professor at the Institute of Chinese Studies at the Heidelberg University. Marina researches China's foreign aid and international development cooperation, but also, and I think we will hear a bit about that today, China's global narratives. Marina is the co-founder of the Decoding China Dictionary, which, in case you don't know it, I can really recommend to look up, and a principal investigator in the Horizon Europe project Deconspirator, which focuses on Chinese and Russian information manipulation and suppression in Europe. All right, enough of introductions. We will do it a little bit differently than the other panel and have a bit longer inputs perhaps in the beginning. So we will start with Tom. And I would basically like to explore you a bit the question of investments, of the BRI and shifts in terms of environmental politics, or rather the role of the environment and climate in BRI investments.
Great, thanks very much. And thanks for having me here. It's great to see so many people in the audience as well. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of China's particularly energy investment and engagement with the Global South. And I'm actually going to focus, because I think it would be most interesting for later discussion, on how that's beginning to change. Not everything I'll be talking about sort of directly relates to environment, but most of it will relate to energy investments, energy cooperation, which of course has major environmental implications, as well as development implications, which is quite important in this topic. But firstly, to recall the first decade or so of the Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm sure you've all heard of and is probably the main vehicle for Chinese investments in the Global South, was really characterized by very large state-backed finance for some quite polluting and often very controversial projects. We saw this particularly in the energy space with a massive amount of investments in and finance for coal power plants, some of which were extremely controversial and received a lot of pushback from local communities, including protests, very negative media coverage, and even some court cases, some of which were successful and led to the halting of coal power plants. So since as early as the first Belt and Road Forum, or perhaps even earlier, there have been concerted efforts to address this from the top. I'm talking quite a top-down perspective here. In particular, led by the MEE, the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, and with quite an interesting array of inputs from domestic universities, think tanks, NGOs, and also international think tanks and NGOs too. At the same time, looking at the kind of domestic context, which we already touched on the last panel, China's industrial and manufacturing base was changing over that decade. And we saw this massive, enormous growth of production of low carbon and green goods, particularly solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles that are sometimes referred to as the new threes in the Chinese government language. So these are a couple of the dynamics that kind of lay the foundation for the changes that I'm going to talk about. So that's sort of missteps in environmental and social impacts of projects overseas, and then the emergence of these low-carbon manufacturing bases in China. So what has this resulted in by now, 2025? Well, firstly, I think it's not entirely clear. I think these changes and evolutions are ongoing, but we can identify a few things that are happening. So firstly, it's pretty clear that China from the top is trying to portray and to make its engagement with Global South countries on energy more green. So we saw this with some of the things that were mentioned in the last panel, the 2021 announcement by Xi Jinping that China wouldn't support any more coal power projects, and the second part of that statement, which was that China would step up its support for green and low carbon energy in the Global South. We also saw around the same time some key government ministries in China releasing environmental guidelines for companies investing overseas. Also, this push is not just rhetoric and statements. We do actually see a shift in energy investments overseas towards green energy. So over the last 2 years, 2023, 2024, investments in renewable energy projects made up the second largest proportion of total energy projects overseas. So there is a real shift going on. At the same time, we're also seeing an emphasis on supporting smaller projects, and this is sometimes referred to as small and beautiful projects. And the idea here, as far as we can tell, is that these are projects that are maybe designed a bit smarter and are supposed to have more kind of co-benefits and spillover effects. So energy for local communities, energy for local factories, and things like this. Relatedly, perhaps, we're also seeing a greater involvement of commercial banks and private creditors rather than state-backed finance, possibly indicating an end to what, or actually I'll correct myself, there's certainly not an end, but possibly indicating a shift away from what some people have referred to as patient capital in China's overseas investments, which is maybe an interesting question to look at. But all that said, Chinese companies are still involved in a number of polluting and controversial projects around the world. Oil and gas remains a massive sector of investment. And indeed, there are still investments going on in some coal power plants. It seems that coal power plants for industrial projects rather than for public utilities is a kind of unstated exemption from the ban on supporting coal power. We've also seen, I said that there's a far greater proportion of investments in renewable energy projects, but at the same time, the overall quantity of investment in energy projects has shrunk a lot since highs around 10 years ago now. And lastly, I should point out that the environmental guidelines from Chinese ministries that I mentioned are very good on paper, but they're entirely voluntary and they have no enforcement mechanisms whatsoever. Nonetheless, there's change happening, and as these dynamics unfold, they're also obviously going to interact with dynamics in Belt and Road countries, in Global South countries. And some of that will also be pushback. So we heard very briefly from a question actually from the audience about how some countries in the Global South are also raising tariffs against Chinese green products. So whilst on the one hand, some of these green products might be a real benefit for achieving energy access and green energy access, but they're also clearly seen by some countries as a threat in some ways as well. So that's kind of my contribution. There's not really a specific point from that other than to say that the Belt and Road and Chinese engagement with the Global South, which has received a lot of attention around the world, it's changing. It's changing quite rapidly. It's changing in quite a few positive directions, but there's quite a few gaps in there as well, and it's important for us to understand those.
Thank you very much. Those were quite some interesting insights. So, Parsifal, if you would kind of comment on that and also share your own insights, how do you perceive these shifts? Do you share them in a way? Do you perceive some differences, particularly when it comes to investments in the mining sector in Latin America?
Hello. Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Merle, and well, thank you to all of you for showing up to hear us talk. So I'll be building on a lot of what Tom has mentioned, but I cannot help myself to begin by saying that I really do not like the term Global South. At least from an analytical perspective, it causes more problems than it actually solves, basically because of how diverse this group of countries are. And if we're talking specifically about China, China has a wide array of policies depending where we stand across the globe. It has different interests in the South China Sea, in Southeast Asia, and its immediacy around Asia than it does in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, or in Europe. That being said, Latin America and the Caribbean, another concept that I have a problem with, for exactly the same reason. And when we're talking about Chinese engagement, it's not the relationship between Beijing and Mexico City is one thing, and then it is with Brasilia, or it is with Santiago de Chile, or with Caracas or La Habana. So when it comes to specifically to environmental policies, it gets even more stark, the differences depending on which country we are talking about. That being said, so this region is the last frontier for China. Why do I say this? Well, two reasons. First, it is the furthest away from China, geographically speaking, and it is within the same sphere. It is within the sphere of influence of the United States. These two factors are key drivers of everything that China does in the region. The U.S. is a very important variable, and it's taken into account across the region. That is something that should always be taken into account when discussing China-Latin America relations, regardless of the policies that we're talking about. Another thing that it's important to take account, which is part of the rhetoric or the narrative promoted not only by China but by many countries across South America about South-South cooperation, and this is a term that it's thrown around across media, across academia, across political circles, and it's important to understand that it's a very ideologically charged a concept, because it's the main driver of this is to put aside the other side of the coin, which is the global north. And if we're going to talk about the environment, there's no way around this about global north, global south countries. These self-imposed divisions, again, I think do more harm than they do good. Well, that's about, enough about context. So, sorry, let me get my notes here. So in Latin America, we have a very diverse energy profile. And often it's determined more by geography than it's actually by policy. What do I mean by this? So if any of you follow or probably have heard that countries like Uruguay and Costa Rica are seen as green pioneers, green leaders, not only regionally but globally. But when you take a close look at these countries, a large part of this success is due to natural endowments, huge rivers, sun all year long. So they're geographically well positioned, plus they can enjoy a much better geographical landscape to take advantage of green technologies. So it's not to take out of a lot of the policies that have centered around these factors, but again, it's when you already are ahead of the curve because of something that you didn't build, it's just the land, it's much easier to do things and than it is for countries that are not as well endowed as a lot of countries across Latin America. To give you one key example, Venezuela up until the 80s and 90s generated over 80% of its entire energy capacity from hydropower, way before any of us, well, most of you probably hadn't been even born yet, but no one was talking about climate change or green energy. This was basically, again, for the same reason, natural resources. Venezuela was even a net exporter of energy to Colombia and to Brazil. That is long gone, but that is for other reasons, not related to what we're talking today. So building on Tom's remarks, I would like to highlight the shift of China's approach to the region in the energy sector or in the green sector. It's very much exemplified across the region. These mega projects that were in the headlines throughout the 2000s, early 2010s, are largely gone. You know, I'd probably say this closed with the inauguration of the Chancay port in Peru just a few months ago, which is a project that began in the mid-2000s. So it predates the Belt and Road. It is something that was incorporated into the Belt and Road eventually, and that happens a lot across Latin America. And I would say a lot, you know, everywhere when it comes to Belt and Road projects. That nowadays I've had the opportunity to engage with a lot of Chinese diplomatic corps, and I always enjoy asking them to define the Belt and Road. I've never gotten the same answer once. It's always different, and that I think that's quite telling. That not even the Chinese government knows what the Belt and Road is or how to define what a Belt and Road a project is. Even though that, if we look at the trends, it's highly focused on infrastructure projects across the globe. So where has this shifted to? Mergers and acquisition is a big one in the energy sector. So we've been seeing a lot of important acquisitions in Argentina, in Chile, in Brazil, in the electric sector. And my guess is that this is, again, looking to a middle, long term, where these key Chinese industries, EVs, solar panels, wind turbines, etc. It's a way to, you know, to facilitate the incorporation and the participation of Chinese companies from all these sectors in particularly in South America, but there are some important cases in Mexico and Central America as well. Important caveat here: despite the shift that we just mentioned, Chinese engagement remains heavily focused on the in mining and extractive sector, especially in critical minerals. Lithium, you know, comes to the table, but, you know, copper, rare earths are very important aspects of Chinese participation in the region that feed into, well, the comments from the previous panel about dominating the entire value chain of these industries. That stems from largely from Latin American and African countries. So, and here we circle back to a historical problem of the region that most countries, not all of them, but most of them, have never, are rentier countries, have been blessed with natural resources, but at the same time it has been so easy to depend on these industries because they don't require diversification. That's why we see booms and busts across the region. And there's a lot of talk about, dependency from China, that China is coming in and it's imposing its tech. And the matter of fact is that this is a two-way street. Nowadays, it's China. Go back 20 years, it was the US. Go back a little bit more, it was Europe. And so this is just the new form of a historical problem from the region. And then this is where the Latin American agency comes in. So it's usually, if we look at especially negative media on China in the Anglosphere that poses China as this, it's coming into the region to devour natural resources and whatnot. And the truth of the matter is that China is just the latest country, but again, it's the type of engagement is quite different from, let's say, the previous countries that have participated in these mining sectors. And well, last but not least, the cooperation, or let's say this two-way street that I mentioned when it comes to the green industry and everything that it's under that umbrella. It has come to Latin America primarily through an economic channel. It's talking about tariffs. Argentina just mentioned a few weeks ago that it's going to eliminate tariffs for electronic vehicles. BYD is a big player, it's a big name. There have been bilateral talks with different regional, local governments in Argentina to talk about importing BYD, not only cars, but also the infrastructure. This is one of the, looking into the future, a lot of countries, the majority of countries, at least outside the main urban centers, do not have the infrastructure for electronic vehicles. So you can guess who's going to be building that infrastructure. I mentioned a lot of points. I'll leave it up to there, and we can, delve more deeply into whatever you're interested in.
Thank you very much. There's a lot in there. I think what I would like to explore next, and also pointing, of course, towards Marina, is a bit the tension that you mentioned in there, right? There's like questions of dependency. You said it's a new form of a historical problem. So we have this on the one hand, right? Like the kind of material analysis of one so words of this relationship. And at the same time, of course, like I said a bit in the introduction, China is portraying itself quite differently, right? So how, Marina, do you think China is portraying itself internationally when it comes to these topics?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Thank you for your inputs. It's kind of a lot food for thought, and I'll try to organize my thoughts and maybe start with the new form of a historical problem. And more or less this time last year, I had the chance to participate at the Resina Dialogue in India. At a panel which was about, China trade in Latin America, and had Jorge Quiroga on the panel, who said that, well, guys, Europeans exploited us, the US exploited us, now China has exploited us, is exploiting us, but at least China is open for trade. Because with the US, you're not going to get any free trade agreements at the moment. And back then, he described the EU-Mercosur, the longest engaged, never married. That has concluded finally after 25 years. So the problem obviously is out there. And what we are seeing from China, this is something I would say it has a historical trajectory. China steps into the void the others have left, be it Europe, be it the United States. We've seen it historically with development cooperation after 1990, when aid lost its geopolitical significance and aid flows to sub-Saharan Africa declined by 40% within very few years. China came with concessional loans, kind of modeled on the Japanese model, and integrated aid, trade, and investment as the new way of win-win foreign aid development cooperation, basically saying, okay, kind of we give you preferential loans for Chinese goods and services, and we call it aid, and kind of you get what you need, and we get export markets. Tom, you mentioned BRI, and let's remember that the spike in BRI loans coincided with Trump 1.0. This was exactly when the Trump government started retreating from development cooperation, and China kind of stepped in with the BRI. And the question is, will we be seeing something similar now with, you know, the dismantling of the USAID, or is it probably enough for China to say, well, we just continue as we did, and just by staying in the game, we show that we are responsible great power? And, you know, to your second question, how does China position itself? China positions itself as a developing country and a major power. This is how the Chinese government defines itself. Now, I'm saying major power. It's dark war. You can translate it as a big country. This is what the Chinese government always says. To my knowledge, it's actually a retranslation of great power from the American discourse. And till early 2023, China was talking about China will always be part of the family of developing countries. It didn't use the term Global South. The term Global South appears in the People's Daily, in the party newspaper, only from spring 23 on. And now China is saying we are part of the Global South and we will always be part of the Global South. And it tells you for China, development is not an economic category. We have a lot of, you know, these debates about, you know, is China still a developing country? What happens? I think 26 and 27, it's supposed to reach, you know, high income level. Will it stop being a developing country? No, because for the Chinese government, being a developing country is not an economic, it's an ideological term. And it's, from the perspective of the Chinese government, this is what gives China legitimacy vis-a-vis developing countries, Global South, whatever, you know, unfitted term we want to use, because it says we are the ones who made it from poverty to superpower through development, and this is an ideological category. So there is a lot of historic continuities, but at the same time, linking to what Tom said, China is learning, and it has been, you know, learning a lot in terms of risk management for projects, in terms of moving away from this huge BRI projects to small and beautiful, at least to a certain extent. We do see actually very good policies coming out from the Chinese government, even if they are voluntarily. The voluntary nature leads to a big implementation gap. So the question is what to do with that. And interestingly enough, and I'm not very familiar with Latin American context, so please kind of correct me if things are different there, but what we've seen in the African context is that whenever governments have pushed against bad practices, China responded and adjusted. Up to like really interesting cases, and I looked into that for a study I did for the Heinrich Böll Foundation, where African trade unions were trying to unionize in Chinese companies and were not successful, and they went, and I think it was either in Kenya or in Namibia, I forgot which case, they went to the Chinese embassy and said, like, look, we try to unionize in your company, they don't want to talk to us. And then the Chinese embassy went to the company and said, so you have to sit down with them. And they managed to unionize, and the Chinese companies have been learning that maybe it's cheaper to have organized labor because they don't go on strike, you can negotiate with them. It's a learning process. So what we've seen is that in countries that have a higher governance capacity, they are better in managing Chinese investment. And maybe kind of, you know, this is the way to go forward. Basically, you know, developing the capacity to understand what are the policies in China, what are the discourses of the Chinese government, because the Chinese government wants to be perceived as a responsible power. They don't want reputational damage. So go to them and say, look, you have these policies. We understand they are kind of voluntarily, but please force your companies to abide by them. And this is, of course, probably, you know, looking at the African context, it's easier to do for South Africa. It's probably not that easy to do for Zambia. In the Latin American context, it will be, again, probably depending on, you know, the size and economic development of the country. But this is, you know, just looking at it systemically, probably something that needs to happen. And basically insist that Chinese companies are held accountable and abide by local standards. And I stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to soon open to the audience, so please start thinking about your questions already. But maybe one last from my side, and of course, please be very, very short in case you do want to give an answer. But I'm wondering, where do you see conflicts in the future, let's say, between China or Chinese government, Chinese industries, right? And related to its investments abroad, but also perhaps in terms of trade relations. Because what I find interesting, for example, and observe is that if the EU imposes tariffs, as it has on Chinese EVs, right, then the Chinese government does react with tariffs on French cognac, for example. If the US imposes tariffs, the Chinese government reacts. But if countries from, well, if developing countries, countries from other continents impose tariffs, which they have, particularly regarding green tech, then the Chinese government does not impose counter tariffs at the moment, in a way to say, well, you know, we can't have a conflict with everyone. But of course, also because it sees itself as the leader among developing nations and wouldn't do that, right? So this might change, though. So I'm just wondering, where do you think in the next decade or so, in the next years to come, things might become more conflictual?
Yeah, thanks. I'll go first with maybe, I'm not entirely sure if this is conflict, but as points of tension, I guess, and on that you were mentioning there, and also came up in the first panel, I think there is a quite a deep contradiction here, because on the one hand there are many countries, and sorry, I will use the term again in this context, in the global south, who look to China as a source of investment in various different sectors, whether that's energy, transport infrastructure, mining, and so on, and see that as a potential source of investment that can stimulate industrialization or the development of manufacturing. And in some ways, China has also, at a kind of top level, has also leaned into this perception that China can provide that. So at the last Belt and Road Forum, there was a sort of subgroup or something set up specifically to look at the question of industrial cooperation. But at the same time, the reality, as we all know, the reality is that China is dominating the space, the value chains in so many industries at the moment that it's very hard for any countries to really compete against that. So that's maybe restating quite a bit of what we've said, but I think there's a really quite fundamental contradiction in there, and more tensions will emerge beyond just some of the tariffs that we mentioned. I think another contradiction that might come up, and again maybe seem like what the Belt and Road Initiative, what the Global Development Initiative has kind of promised, hasn't quite come to fruit, is that when you actually break, and here's where we do have to go beyond just talking about the Global South as a generic kind of term. When you actually look at the geographic breakdown of where many of these Chinese investments are into kind of useful infrastructure, such as rail and energy and power lines and so on, it by and large is going to sort of middle income countries and emerging markets. It's not going into least developed countries. And these least developed countries are some of the countries that are most in need of investment for general development purposes, but also bringing it back to the main theme of the discussion, also in the face of the climate crisis, least developed countries are extremely vulnerable, and they're not receiving the assistance that they need from the West or the global North, nor from China.
Okay, well, two quick points before I answer your questions. One is going back to the agency of Latin American countries. It's a very easy scapegoat to say that we were exploited. We were exploited 500 years ago. That's the history. Without getting too much into history, it's just nowadays, or at least for the last 5 decades, that is a term that has been used within Latin American countries primarily by the left to as an easy scapegoat and not to affront the realities and to exert its agency across the region to get things done. There are multiple examples across the globe of countries, making their way up the income ladder, and with everything, all the huge potential that was granted just by geography that our countries have, there's no excuse, and you will hear this over and over, especially nowadays. It's always easy. It's easy to blame the U.S. It's easy to blame the Europeans. It's our problems are, we just have to look in the mirror. So that's a very important thing, and that applies again to China, because China, you will see China increasingly being blamed for problems that are our own. So having mentioned that conflict, I do see a space for increased conflict, primarily because the PRC, I'm generalizing here, but it's primarily seen as an opportunity for investment. Within the energy transition is seen as a tech powerhouse who we can buy from, who we can learn from. But by and large, across the regions, doesn't have the expertise, not at a government level, not at a civil society level, not within NGOs, not at universities, to deal with an actor as complex as the PRC and its vast, on the one hand, its bureaucracy and how its companies operate abroad. And that is bound to generate problems down the line. Latin American countries, a lot of them, especially the closer you get to the US, the more true this is, are very experienced at dealing with US bullying. They have no idea what PRC bullying means or how it would manifest, be it through tariffs, be it through economic coercion or whatnot. We've seen isolated cases, nothing of the sorts of what the region has suffered across the decades from the U.S. But you're increasingly seeing, pointed policies. On the one hand, using tariffs. On the other one, just threatening not to buy X or Y commodity. Countries like Chile, Chile exports around, I think it's around 40% of all its exports go to China. And its main driver of GDP, it's its copper industry. 70% of its copper industry goes to China. I do not see, President Boric or anyone who comes after him, criticizing China in any regard, because they are so dependent. And odds are that, given the techno-nationalism that these national champions within the tech/energy sector are going to be are going to have an increased participation across the board. And I believe, well, I don't remember who mentioned this, but China is filling a lot of voids, and this is a new void that wasn't there before, and I see a lot of upside. But if it's not done hand in hand with greater understanding of how the PRC works and how its foreign policy, its interests, this is gonna lead to problems down the line.
Maybe to pick up your point on the tariffs and counter tariffs, if we believe what the Chinese government says, then China's foreign policy is highly relational and oriented towards maintaining, managing relationships and creating obligations. In this context, Global South for China is a political concept that means non-West. And China describing itself as part of the global south means China being not West. If China argues that it is a developing country and the great power and the leader of the global south, it needs the global south to be on its side. It needs to, create circumstances and favors that it gets votings in the United Nations on topics of core Chinese interests like Taiwan or Hong Kong or South China Sea and so on and so forth. To impose counter tariffs in this context would mean switching sides and treating the global south like it treats the West. And that would mean losing much of the political capital and leverage. So I think, and we know that China is very tough in pushing for its interests, but I think this will create a very difficult situation for China. And my educated guess would be if we are, if we're going to be dealing with substantial tariffs on Chinese goods, that the Chinese government will try to find ways to resolve it without, direct responses, retaliation, or without an open confrontation. So the pressure will be, very different, whether it's, elite collaborations and things like that. But I don't...
That's the expertise I'm referring about.
Yeah, but probably not direct counter tariffs, I would guess.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience? 3. Okay, so let's take these 3, and then we might already finish, to be honest. Oh, okay, of course. But then we take them all in one row, I think.
Okay, shall we start here, or did you pick one before? Okay.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed listening to you. I learned so much. I have 2 questions. First is on this term of global north and south. I was, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that originally this global south was kind of a term that was used to replace developing countries a few years ago in the discourse internationally at international conferences and organizations. And the idea is that the term developing countries had, bad connotations. So then somehow we're replacing the word with the term global south, which is, I mean, to me, it was kind of odd because to me, developing countries sounds more, global south sounds worse than developing countries. But I don't know like the history of the term. But my question is, I agree that it's problematic, but I've also noticed, and setting aside the China trying to be a part of it, can leave China aside. I do notice that countries in the so-called global south or policymakers and politicians have started to use the term to describe themselves, in part to kind of search for some kind of solidarity, maybe, again, keep China out of this. But I feel like there is this sense, this kind of disenchantment with the liberal international order, Western hypocrisy. So there is a sense of growing solidarity amongst these countries. So then to what extent is this term, or how do you feel about that? And then maybe it really has nothing to do with a term now. And my second question is on this expertise thing, which I think is really important. My question is, do you see, and is there space or resources or possibilities for emerging expertise on China within Latin America, but also elsewhere, and also within China, there's we see these area study centers being set up at universities, and one of my concerns is that I hope it's not done for opportunistic reasons, and just for being able to make better money, but also having experts that understand these regions and countries on their terms, and just to produce knowledge and to understand them for the sake of understanding. But then assuming that's a goal in China, but also in these countries, and what are there opportunity for that, resources for that at all?
Thanks also from my side for the valuable inputs you've made. I'm Hendrik Schnittger from the German NGO PowerShift, and we're working on human rights abuses in the mining sector and the environmental destruction in that sector. And I'm particularly working on a case in Guinea where we have a Chinese mining company that is very hard to get to. And you've briefly touched upon how to address these actors. So my question would be if you have any advice on how to effectively address Chinese companies or Chinese finance companies in countries in the global south.
So don't be afraid of using the term. I'm not going to get mad or anything.
Thank you for this very interesting panel. I have a question for Marina. So you said that that China considers itself part of the global south, or as a development country, is kind of an ideological stance more than it is an economic stance. And I'm just wondering whether it is also a strategic stance. So, for example, if we think about its stance considering loss and damages at the UNFCCC, so China is very eager to kind of say that they're not a developing country, not a developed country, so not in a responsibility to provide these funds. And yeah, I would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
So there'd be space for one more question if somebody wants to. Christian.
Thank you very much. A question for Parzival. I conducted field work on the copper belt in Zambia and on the social and environmental context of that. And you might know C.K. Lee, and she establishes the two different notions of capital, neoliberal private capital and Chinese state-owned capital. And they work through different types of accumulation. She calls it, I think, profit maximization and profit optimization. I would be really interested in your comparative perspective in countries of South America. Do these different sorts of companies behave differently? Chinese companies versus, let's say, a neoliberal private company when it comes to environmental politics and social impact in the context of mining. Thank you.
Should we start with Marina this time?
Yeah, thank you for the really, really great questions. And maybe I'll start with the chronological order. Yeah, and on the global south. So I've written, for those of you who read German, I've written an article on that last year in Internationale Politik, and I wasn't using the term because my kind of pre-academic background, I used to work for GIZ, so I'm a former aid professional. I was struggling with developing countries as a term. I was struggling with the global south as a term. Then last year, again, I went to Resina, and oops, everybody from the global south. China was not really present, but it was obviously, India, China was not invited. Taiwan was there. Everybody was using the term. So I thought, okay, so maybe the term it's okay. And then kind of linking to your point on the solidarity and disenchantment with the liberal international order, Bilahari Kausikan made this interesting elaboration, and so the China-Africa podcast is now the China Global South podcast. Kind of they quoted them saying like global south is essentially the usefulness of its term is this collective expression of the frustration with the harmony of certain ideas, statements of the West. And I mean, he says China has been doing a good job again, filling the void and, playing to the sentiments. But now a colleague of mine told me last week that he was told by Indonesians not to use the term, but rather use developing countries. So I think us from, the global north can't really do it right. So we have to live with, that no matter whether we say global south or developing countries, we will be stepping on somebody's toes. But I think the term has its usefulness for the rest who is unhappy with the West. Now, with your question on, or your point on the area studies, what I find really interesting, I did my PhD on Chinese aid. And what I noticed is that if you read through, Chinese articles or ministry statements since the 1960s, and I'm taking Africa as a case because I did a lot on that, since the 1960s till today, you read, we don't understand them. And you read it in 1966, in 86, 2016, you read it in 24. So obviously there is this very long feeling that we are dealing with these countries, there is a cultural gap, we don't understand them, and it's absolutely reasonable because there was no really anthropological studies, there was not this experience of going to other countries during your university times and learning about them. And then suddenly you have China Development Bank being world's largest bilateral lender. If you look at the board, they all come from China's agricultural development. And suddenly they go to Africa, build roads. What could possibly go wrong? So obviously you need to change something. And my hope, like in your case, is actually that there is a genuine wish and investment to learn. And it sounds really plausible to me because there is a real problem to be solved. I would hope that, and we are seeing that there's a lot of scholarships for Global South students, that there's going to be more exchange and really genuine learning on that. Henrik, to your point, was Henrik, right? Yeah. So, mining companies are really dirty business, and I think Christian is probably, very qualified to talk about that. But if there is any recommendation, is first, publicity, because we often think that China is this top-down monolithic thing and the central government knows everything which is happening on the ground. And in reality, very often it's not the case. And if something goes wrong, very often they would learn it through the New York Times. Right? So one thing is really create visibility, create publicity, have protests, have strike, but then also approach the Chinese embassy and really get on their nerves, or have the ambassador talk to their counterparts in Beijing and say, look, you're saying you want to have a clean, honest, green Belt and Road, but your company is doing this. So please get your house in order. And I'm not saying it's easy, it's definitely not. But from what we have observed so far, where we've seen successes, this is how it worked. It's basically creating bad reputation for the Chinese state. The last question, I'm sorry, I don't know how to address you because you didn't say your name, but on, whether being part of the Global South is strategic, absolutely. With the UNFCCC, China is saying common but differentiated responsibilities. Yes, we do have responsibilities, but you are the ones who, spend so much time polluting the world. So don't tell us now we have the biggest responsibility. And there is, if we're really, really honest, there is some reason to Chinese argument, because a lot of Chinese pollution is actually our pollution, because this is where we produce the goods we consume. So we outsourced that pollution to China. We are now, unfortunately, seeing Chinese companies, because China has introduced stricter environmental laws, behaving quite similarly like our companies behaved in the 1980s. So when we started having strict environmental laws, they went to countries where they could pollute, like China. Now we see Chinese companies moving out of China to other places where they can pollute. But in terms of responsibility, I think we really need to be honest in this debate that just a substantial part of the pollution China produces, it's ours that we have outsourced. So we can't simply say, China should solve it, but there probably we need to take the Chinese argument seriously. Thank you.
Yes, I'll quickly add to Marina's point on that I read about it in the New York Times just recently in Colombia. Well, last year, end of last year, there was this huge scandal with Colombia's largest gold mine with a Chinese company, and a Chinese company has a concession to exploit the mine, and there was a big scandal. Some people were kidnapped. You can read about it afterwards if you're interested. And the story popped up. I don't remember if it was the Washington Post or New York Times or one of both. And when I say we, I mean our organization. We have a good relationship with the Chinese embassy in Bogota. And well, it turns out this story, well, started in Colombia, was covered by a U.S. mainstream newspaper, ended up in Beijing. They were very mad about this. And then they called the embassy, and the embassy then called the company. So it was like this full circle. Apparently, yeah, they were reprimanded for sure by the embassy, and this, well, it's still sort of like ongoing nowadays behind closed doors. So I don't know, but it very much works that way. Okay, to answer the questions. So expertise and funding across Latin America. I'll give you a very quick example. Our organization, we are 5 people. Well, actually now 3, including myself, because of all the problem with international funding coming out from the US. Outside of Chinese-funded institutions and universities, we, across Latin America, a region of more than 600 million people, we are the only independent NGO that studies China. That's it. You have centers at universities, and you have an increasing number of we could call them think tanks. Some of them are sort of NGOs that are funded by the PRC. This is a huge problem. The other side of that coin is that we have, across our work, we've seen an increased interest, especially amongst university students, graduate students, about learning more about China. So there seems to be a traction there. But sadly, I think to our knowledge, the only country that finances important research and policy-oriented research on China is Chile. It's the only one. And this is rather new. This is just from like 5 years ago. And that speaks volumes. And this is not something new. In financing for think tanks, universities, across the region, we have historically been dependent on the United States. I don't know to what extent, but it for sure is the majority, and with with some extent to the European Union. Yes, that's a huge problem that we have. We've dictated with people from government, and they don't want to. You cannot call them capacity building because politicians they know everything. They don't need to be taught anything. So we call them private roundtables on China. But we've done some things with journalists, and the interest is there. It's palpable. But sadly, China is little by little filling that void, and obviously, I have colleagues that have received a PRC funding, and they do great work with PRC funding. The problem is it's only focused on the areas that that shed a positive light on China, which is important. But you're missing the other side of the spectrum. Well, well, I hope that answers your question. Behavior of PRC companies and international, primarily Western companies, especially in South America, like Canadian companies have a terrible reputation. They have a terrible track record. Yeah, that's one of them. And this also touches on Marina's points that in a lot of cases it depends on the level of rule of law and strength in institutions, and the strength of institutions to bring companies into account. We have done studies across the Andean region, and these are the same companies, and they have very different results depending on which country. So it's the same variable. What varies is the level of rule of law, I would say primarily, and of environmental protection laws and implementation that varies dramatically. It's the same mining companies that operate in Chile. Chile hasn't had one, scandal with Chinese companies, not one. The same company in Peru, totally different story. So again, yes, PRC companies, I think they adapt very well to their environment. There's been a steep learning curve for them. Venezuela was a huge learning experience on what not to do. I always say that, and I've studied this in depth, Venezuela was probably one of the biggest fiascos for China worldwide in terms of economic engagement, participation, and in every sense of the word. And I think it was part of a wake-up call, and I couldn't agree more that especially the Chinese government cares about the reputation of China, the China brand. But again, this has been mentioned across the day. It's not they don't have the power to just go and tell companies exactly what to do. It's way more complex than that. Especially abroad, overseas, in Latin America, it's complex. So that's why it's very important to create the expertise amongst policymakers. One thing that the region has going for it is that we have a very, very active civil society. I don't know, I'm ignorant about this, it's not my area of expertise, but I would say it's amongst the strongest across the globe, and very committed investigative journalism networks. Problem is that a lot of that was financed till recently by the United States, largely because it's local governments don't finance that kind of work. We'll see what happens, and I really doubt that China will come into it. Won't.
That'd be the biggest surprise. Yeah, I'll just offer just additions, I guess, to two of those questions there. One about the Global South and the other about engaging with Chinese companies or embassies. Others up here have already said plenty about the Global South thing, but just to kind of emphasize, I think, like, sometimes it's not a useful term for our kind of analyses and understanding sort of how the world works, but it is a term that is used by many countries around the world in a very purposeful way, like it is part of their diplomatic language, and for that reason we should take the term seriously in those contexts. Also, to add to that is this idea of Global South as providing some kind of unity for these non-Western countries. This might be a relatively new term, but it's not a new idea. And I think there's some kind of lineage back to, for example, the Bandung Conference, which is very important in the history of the development of China's foreign policy, and through there into like the non-aligned movement, and then develop versus developing, and into this term, the global south. And just to say, talking of sort of historical echoes as well, like China might be leaning quite strongly into this term of global south in itself as a member of the global south, but it certainly doesn't have a monopoly of that term or that idea, in the same way that it didn't have a monopoly on the movement that came out of Bandung, although sometimes when you see Chinese foreign ministries releases about Bandung, they kind of sounds like they were sort of a central player in that. Actually, they weren't. They were invited fairly last minute. They were not the leaders in that initiative, which, by the way, was 70 years ago this year, 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. So then, just some then additions onto engaging with Chinese companies or Chinese embassies. So kicking up a storm and getting the attention of the embassy and stuff like that is important. I think what's quite interesting to highlight there is that actually, if you trace back sort of institutionally in China who has responsibility for oversight of these companies and so on, it's not the embassies or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but what we have seen in a number of case studies. Is that once a scandal is created, it's normally the embassies that come in and are kind of like firefighting, like crisis, sort of crisis comms role. And actually, when that happens, they quite often put on quite a charm offensive and invite sort of local community and NGOs and so on into the embassy for discussions, which also gives a degree of access. The two other things I'd say on that is, from experience working with journalists in countries where there have been some scandals involving Chinese companies, it also often depends on the ambassador in that country. I mean, it depends on personnel and whether they are open to engaging with communities, or whether they push back, and literally, this is not a joke, push back and say, this is a Western conspiracy. I mean, there are examples where you can point to both. There was an ambassador in Sierra Leone quite some years ago, before any of these environmental social guidelines, who was pretty open to local communities and journalists and so on coming into the embassy to talk about fishing and overfishing in particular. But take another example from Zimbabwe a few years ago. I'm not sure if it's the same ambassador there now, but when the embassy received complaints about social environmental issues around Chinese mines, or the embassy published an article on the website saying that this, like, sort of evidencing that this was a US conspiracy along those lines. So there's not a specific playbook about how the embassies engage with civil society, and I think it does kind of depend on personnel sometimes. And then the last point on that, I don't think was, or maybe it was mentioned, but I think it's quite, when you do get opportunities for engagement with companies or embassies, trying to speak as much as possible in the language of the Chinese state and the Chinese policy environment. So really referencing back to these guidelines, best practices, diplomatic statements that have been made, and so on. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much for these fascinating insights and for responding to all these questions. Sorry for going over time. We had a busy group of students who have a next appointment. In case you don't, please join us for drinks and finger food now. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Thanks you three, and have a good evening.